Hello, everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. Story 1. The Window on Marrow Street, Portland, Oregon, in December 21 is a study in muted colors and constant, pervasive dampness. I was Daniel Reeves, 26, a freelance graphic designer, and my world was confined to the second-floor apartment I rented off Marrow Street. The building was old brick, the heating erratic, and the only compelling view was directly across the narrow alley, the monolithic, decaying structure of an abandoned spice warehouse. My routine was driven by deadlines, not daylight. I worked late, fueled by stale coffee and the low, aggressive buzz of fluorescent signs from the late-night corner store down the street. The steady rain was always tapping the glass of my window, a constant, irritating percussion that intensified the solitude. I was seeking peace, but the building opposite offered only a perpetual, cold void. Every window was shattered or boarded, every shadow deep and absolute. It was a tomb of industry. The pattern began 3 weeks after I moved in. I was hunched over my monitor, finalizing a terrible logo design, when I heard the low, mournful sound of distant train horns cutting through the rain. I glanced at the taskbar clock 2:00 a.m. exactly. I looked up, stretching, and my eyes drifted to the warehouse. In the absolute darkness of the structure, one window high up, 4th floor, dead center, was suddenly lit. The light wasn't electric. It was a pale, sickly yellow, like a cheap candle or a weak oil lamp. It flickered erratically, throwing chaotic shadows against the grimy glass. And in that light, I saw the figure. It was a man, utterly motionless, facing my apartment. His outline was dense, heavy, just a silhouette framed by the flickering, weak light. His head was slightly tilted, suggesting a long, fixed stare. I froze, adrenaline spiking. The warehouse was sealed. It had been condemned for 5 years. There was no power, no heat, no way for anyone to be up there. I rationalized it immediately: a vagrant, a temporary fire, a truck headlight reflecting off a broken shard of glass. I waited for a few minutes, staring. The figure did not move. The light continued its fragile, sickening flicker. Then, with a final, hard stutter, the light snapped off. The warehouse returned to total darkness, indistinguishable from the black December night. My curiosity quickly spiraled into fixation. The event repeated every night. At 2:00 a.m., the light would appear, the figure would materialize, and the silent, heavy observation would begin. I started adjusting my schedule around the clock. I would clean my lenses, open my window, and even use my design software's zoom filter on my phone, trying to pull clarity from the impossible distance. The best I ever got was the dense, black oval of his head, forever locked in that upward, fixed stare. The rain tapping the glass no longer sounded like weather. It sounded like fingers drumming. I started to feel that the apartment was too bright, too exposed. I felt like a museum exhibit. I would pull the blinds, then immediately snap them back open, driven by a desperate, terrifying need to know if the figure was still there. The answer was always yes. The figure became my personal anchor, a grotesque punctuation mark to my lonely days. The silence in my apartment at night was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. The subtle violations began small. I would leave my desk to make tea, and when I returned, my chair would be pushed slightly off-center. I would tell myself it was me, my own nervous energy, but the dread mounted. Then, the fixation shattered into raw fear. It was 2:05 a.m. I was standing in front of my darkened monitor, looking past my own reflection at the warehouse. The rain was coming down in sheets, making the glass opaque with running water. I stared at the specific window. It was dark, empty. He wasn't there. I sighed, relieved. The silence had finally broken the pattern. I turned my head away, but the movement caught the reflection in my massive black monitor screen. The screen was like a perfect, polished mirror in the dark room. And in that reflection, standing directly behind me, positioned in the doorway of my apartment, was the figure. It was the same dense silhouette, the same unnervingly still posture. It was not a distortion of the light. It was a figure standing inside my apartment in the reflection, watching me. I spun around, flashlight in hand. The doorway was empty. The room was silent, filled only with the high-pitched hum of the old refrigerator. I walked to the window, staring out at the warehouse. The light was still off. I moved back to the monitor. The reflection was back. The figure stood in my doorway, looking over my shoulder at the screen, at me, in perfect, terrifying stillness. The terror was absolute. He wasn't in the warehouse. He was here. He was using the external building as a distraction, while his true presence occupied the blind spots of my own home. I felt the urge to scream, but the sound lodged in my throat. I couldn't move. I stared at my reflection and the monstrous reflection behind me, knowing that the invasion was complete. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the monitor screen, until I reached the hallway. I grabbed my wallet and jacket, left the keys in the lock, and ran from the apartment. I drove until the Portland lights were just a pale smear in my rearview mirror. 2 days later, hiding out in a cheap motel room 3 states away, the cold dread finally gave way to a need for certainty. I had left my laptop running, and before I fled, I had pointed my webcam, set to record toward the main living area and the doorway. I pulled up the stored video file, my hands shaking so violently I had to brace the phone against the table. The footage was static, blurry, but clear enough. It showed me sitting at my desk, working frantically, occasionally glancing up at the window, checking for the figure in the distant warehouse. I scrubbed the footage to the moment of my breakdown, 2:05 a.m., when the reflection appeared. The camera was pointed directly at the doorway where the reflection had stood. The frame was empty. I exhaled a breath of momentary relief. It was a hallucination. But then, the footage continued. I watched myself stand up and spin around, checking the doorway with my flashlight. As I checked the doorway, the figure moved. From the deep, unlit corner of the room, behind the heavy bookshelf, a shape detached itself from the shadows. It was the same dense, tall silhouette. The figure moved with slow, measured steps, gliding across the floor, staying entirely out of the limited cone of my flashlight beam. The video showed the figure standing silently, less than 3 feet behind me. During the entire 5 minutes, I was staring at the window. He was so close that his shadow would have fallen across my back, but I hadn't felt it. The footage reached the final moment, the moment I ran. I watched myself flee the apartment. Then, the camera focused solely on the silent, empty room. The only movement was the rain tapping the glass in the background. The figure, now alone in the apartment, slowly walked toward the camera. He stopped inches from the lens, close enough that his deep-set eyes, now finally visible in the grainy light, seemed to pierce the screen. He didn't move for 10 seconds. Then, his head tilted slightly, a posture of final, cold satisfaction. The expression was not malice, but possession. And then, the figure reached out a single pale hand and tore the webcam clean off the desk. The screen went black. The date stamp on the final frozen frame was December 18th, 2021. The inventory was complete. Story 2, The Voice Under the Floorboards. Moving to Lafayette, Louisiana in October 2020 was a necessity, not a choice. I was Laura Mendez, 33, a single mother, and the cheap, aging house I rented was the best I could afford. It was low to the ground, built on cinder blocks, and smelled perpetually of damp earth and old wood. The house had its own soundtrack, which usually masked the outside world, the relentless buzz of the window AC unit, struggling against the heavy Louisiana humidity, and the sporadic, metallic drip of the pipes somewhere beneath the kitchen sink. At night, the whole structure would groan and sigh, the soft creak of wood settling at midnight, becoming a familiar, almost comforting presence. Comfortable until the third week. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for exhaustion to claim me. The air conditioner was humming loudly. It was well past midnight. And then I heard it. It was a whisper, soft, muffled, and undeniably human. It came from directly beneath my bedroom floorboards. I immediately sat up. The sound was so faint, so delicate. It could have been the wind or a mouse, but it carried a shape, a rhythm. I held my breath, straining to hear over the AC. The house creaked once, a slow, deep sound. And then the whisper came again, closer, colder. It spoke my name, Laura. The sound wasn't distorted by distance. It was muffled by matter. It was coming from the narrow, dark space between the joists and the dirt, the crawl space. My initial reaction was pure denial. A ghost, a trick of the wiring, a neighbor's radio bleeding through the walls. But I knew the truth the way you know the floor's cold when you step on it. There was a man under my house, and he knew my name. The event repeated every night, always past midnight, always preceded by the soft creak of the floorboards, as if someone was carefully shifting their weight down below. The voice would whisper simple, devastating things. "It's cold down here, Laura," or "I see the light under your door." I moved my bed, covered the floor in rugs, and even turned the air conditioner up to maximum volume, hoping the roar would drown out the dread. It never did. The whispers were always perfectly audible, cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. The fear turned to absolute sick horror when the whispers became personal. One evening, I had spent 2 hours in the living room on the phone, arguing with my ex-husband about child support. I had been crying, my voice low and ragged. That night, the clock ticked past 1:00 a.m. The house was silent except for the familiar drip of the pipes. "He sounded angry tonight, Laura," the voice whispered from directly under my pillow. "He shouldn't yell at you." I couldn't move. The man under the house hadn't just heard the conversation. He had processed it, interpreted it, and was now offering intimate, terrifying commentary. He wasn't transient. He was a permanent fixture of my domestic life, privy to my deepest vulnerabilities. The horrified acceptance came 3 days later. I had to know. I had to see the darkness he inhabited. The access panel to the crawl space was outside, behind a stack of rotting lumber near the back porch. I waited until noon, when the sun was high and the humid air felt less threatening. I grabbed the heavy crowbar from the garage, my hands slick with sweat, and pried the rotten wooden hatch open. A burst of stale, cold air that smelled overwhelmingly of mold, dust, and human sweat hit my face. I aimed my flashlight into the low, black void. The space was tight, supported by cinder blocks, the dirt floor uneven, but it was not empty. Tucked into the far corner, nestled beside a main support beam, was a small, dusty collection of objects. First, a small battery-operated radio, tuned low, emitting a soft, faint static. The source of the organ music or the children's laughter I had occasionally heard through the floor. Second, a neatly folded gray blanket and a flattened empty water bottle. And third, the object that shattered my remaining sanity, a small, clean, plastic container. Inside it was a slice of fresh bread and a single, untouched, foil-wrapped energy bar. The items were not moldy or stale. They were recently acquired. The realization was immediate and cold. The man under the house was not trapped. He was being sustained. He was being provided for, either by someone else or by his own trips in and out of the crawlspace. This was not a desperate, temporary hideout. It was a chosen, functional residence. I backed away slowly, closing the hatch without a sound. I left the crowbar on the ground. I realized the voice wasn't a warning. It was a claim. The man under the house was not just watching me. He was living parallel to my life, waiting, sustained by the house itself. I packed the car and fled Lafayette that afternoon, never looking back at the cheap, low-slung house that hid a secret life beneath its floorboards. It's 6 months later. I am living in a high-rise apartment in Miami, Florida. The air is dry and sanitized. The sounds are city noises and the floor is solid, unforgiving concrete. I finally feel safe. My baby, whom I had forgotten to mention in my frantic escape, is asleep in his crib. I'm sitting in the living room, listening to the comforting, steady rhythm of the baby monitor resting on the coffee table. The silence from the nursery is absolute. White noise on the speaker. Then, the static breaks. The sound is faint, almost absorbed by the distance, but the quality is immediate and unmistakable, the familiar, muffled tone of a whisper. I lean toward the monitor, my heart hammering a thick rhythm against the silence of the room. The whisper was close, intimate. "Good night, Laura." The buzz of the window AC in the Miami apartment suddenly felt very loud, and the concrete beneath my feet felt terrifyingly thin. The invasion hadn't been confined to the house. It had been routed, rebroadcast, and the voice under the floorboards had simply found a new receiver. Story 3. The Man Who Never Left the Store. My life in Amarillo, Texas, in March 2019 was the definition of monotony. I was Tyler Grant, 22, putting myself through college by working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. After 2:00 a.m., the world outside went quiet, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerators and the frantic, erratic buzz of the neon signs that advertised cheap beer and stale coffee. The entire place perpetually reeked of stale coffee, old cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of gasoline. My routine was simple stock shelves, wipe down the counter, and wait for the sun. The isolation was usually a comfortable, predictable thing. Then the routine broke with the arrival of the man. He was a regular, but I never caught his name. Mid-50s, nondescript dark jacket, the kind of quiet, forgettable face that blends into every background. He would arrive around 1:30 a.m., buy a cup of coffee, and sit at the small, dusty table near the window. He never read, never looked at his phone. He just stared at the passing traffic with an unnerving stillness. My discomfort began the night the manager decided to start locking the door at 2:00 a.m. for security, even though the store was technically still open for window service. The clock hit 2:00 a.m. I flipped the internal lock switch, the deadbolt snapping home with a loud metallic thunk. I then did a quick sweep, checking for any remaining customers. I saw him immediately. The man was still at his table. "Sir, we just locked up," I said, trying to be polite. "I'll have to ask you to head out." He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just slowly lifted his coffee cup to his lips, his eyes fixed on the empty street outside. I tried again, firmer this time. "I need you to leave now, sir." He still didn't move. The hum of the refrigerators suddenly felt very loud, masking any potential noise he might make. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding, before deciding confrontation wasn't worth the minimum wage. I left him there, trapped inside the locked store. I spent the next hour stalking the chips aisle, my anxiety a constant, cold wait. Every time I glanced back, he was still sitting there, completely motionless, his dark silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light. At 3:00 a.m., I checked the front again. He was gone. The table was empty. His empty coffee cup sat on the edge, leaving a small, damp ring on the dusty laminate. I checked the front door, still locked. The fire exit was bolted shut and alarmed. There was absolutely no way he could have left. The terror began when I reviewed the security footage. I pulled up the feed on the small, grainy monitor in the back room, the screen's perpetual flicker casting a pale, sickly light on the walls. I scrubbed the time back to 1:30 a.m. I watched him walk in, buy his coffee, and sit down. I fast-forwarded to 2:00 a.m. The door locks. I approach the table. He lifts the cup. All correct. I scrubbed ahead to 3:00 a.m. The table is empty. The cup is there. I went back, frame by frame, watching the table in high-speed anxiety. At 2:47 a.m., the figure simply vanished. One frame he was there, sitting still. The next frame, the chair was empty. There was no movement, no getting up, no walking out of the frame. He just erased himself from the footage. I was cold with dread, but I had to check the entry footage. I pulled up the separate feed for the front door, scrubbing back to 1:30 a.m. The footage showed a blur of headlights, a car pulling up to the pump, and a few customers entering. But the man was never there. I watched the clock tick past 1:30 a.m., 1:40 a.m., and 1:50 a.m. He never entered the store. The impossibility of it fractured my sanity. He was a phantom, a fixed presence that appeared inside a locked building and vanished without moving. Yet the register had his transaction, and I had interacted with him. My fear reached its chilling peak when I played the real-time footage from the moment I checked the cameras. I sat in the back room, watching the live feed of the store. The CCTV screen flickered with the familiar, grainy image of the empty aisles and the counter. The clock in the corner read 3:45 a.m. I was alone. I knew I was alone. But in the live feed, reflected faintly in the glass of the main refrigerator door next to the coffee station, a shadow moved. I zoomed in frantically on the frozen goods aisle. And there he was, the man, standing perfectly still in the frozen foods aisle, staring directly at the camera. He was not in the real world. I looked over my shoulder. Through the gap in the back room door, the frozen foods aisle was empty, bathed in the white, humming light. But on the CCTV monitor, he was there. Then, the terrifying, final violation. I watched him slowly turn his head, not toward the aisle, but toward the back office. The camera he was looking into was above the main counter, angled down. Yet, in the reflection, he was staring directly at the lens. And then, he took a step. He walked out of the frozen foods aisle, moving silently, deliberately, and stood directly behind the figure of myself visible in the corner of the back room monitor. The figure in the reflection was staring over my monitor, over my shoulder, at the live feed, at me. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. I just slowly, carefully, slid the chair back and walked out of the back room, leaving the monitor flickering with the impossible, terrifying dual reality. I left the gas station, the smell of gasoline suddenly making me nauseous, and never looked back at Amarillo. It's 4 years later. I finished college, moved to New York, and now work a safe, remote job. The memory of the gas station has faded into a bad dream, a product of sleep deprivation and cheap coffee. I was watching the evening news, a random broadcast about a minor political rally in San Diego. The camera panned across a crowd, a sea of anonymous faces. I was about to change the channel when my eyes caught a detail in the deep background. Standing on the periphery of the crowd, separated from the noise and movement, was a figure, mid-50s, nondescript dark jacket. His back was mostly to the camera, but his posture was unmistakable, unnervingly still, utterly separate from the activity around him. The camera lingered for a second, then panned on. But in that brief moment, I saw him. The figure slowly turned his head and looked directly at the news camera. His face was unreadable in the distance, but the gesture, the fixed, silent gaze was the same. The segment ended, and the anchor returned. I sat motionless, staring at the blank screen, realizing that the man hadn't been confined to the gas station in Amarillo. He was simply waiting for the next CCTV-style broadcast to materialize in the background of my life. You've heard 3 stories tonight. 3 ordinary people who thought they were safe in their own homes, their own towns, their own beds. They all made the same mistake, thinking that horror lives somewhere else. But the truth is, horror waits, quietly, just beyond the light of your screen. So if you can't sleep tonight, if you think you heard something move in the dark corner of your room, don't check, don't look, just keep listening. This has been Fearmonger. If you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Because the shadows already know.